Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we continue to get perspectives on the war in Ukraine. Might be the last one we do, at least for the coming days, as the Senate Judiciary Committee begins confirmation hearings for Ketanji Jackson Brown to join the United States Supreme Court next week. The hearings would be next week. It's very possible we will be doing live coverage of those hearings. But to conclude these series, at least temporarily, I'm very happy to be joined by one of the best-known anti-war activists in the country today, Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is co-founder of Code Pink and the author of a number of books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. She joins me from Washington, D.C. Medea Benjamin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program. Thank you for taking this time.
Nice to be on with you, Mitch.
It's great to have you. We have been doing a series of conversations about getting perspectives from people who identify as being on the left concerning the war in Ukraine. The perspectives have ranged from those who directly are critical of the United States and NATO expansion, meddling with internal politics of Ukraine, to other people who emphasize standing with Ukraine and Ukrainians as it's violently attacked, and that this is Russia fulfilling its own imperial ambitions. Those are the polls. Most people have made arguments that are more nuanced than that, but those are sort of the polls of the two arguments. I want to know, as an anti-war activist here in the United States, what is your approach to this war? How do you see this war?
I see it as a war of aggression on the part of Russia, a war that is brutal, that is unjustified, that is illegal. And I think it's important for people who consider themselves anti-war people to be very clear about how war is awful, this war is awful, and Russia's war was unjustified. But there is another part of the explanation, which is to say that we have to understand what lies behind the war. And for U.S. citizens, we have to understand the role that our government has played in stoking the tensions that led to this war. So we certainly, as Code Pink, go into all of these issues that range from the expansion of NATO, and Code Pink is a group that has been clearly against NATO since the time we started 20 years ago. We have always said that NATO should have dissolved at the time when the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 1991. We've been part of a no to NATO group that meets every time NATO gathers, whether it's in Europe or in the United States. And we're right there, Mitch, saying no to NATO, dissolve NATO. In fact, getting arrested in Chicago when they had the NATO summit there. And we're very close to European groups that have been not only with us on this, but really leading the charge against NATO, because as hopefully your listeners know, NATO is an alliance that is not, as we've been hearing in the corporate news, a purely defensive one, but has been an offensive one. And for our European friends, they have been fighting the NATO goal of spending 2% of their GDP on the military, because they look at the United States and say, we don't want to spend so much on our military. We want national health care systems. We want free college education for our young people. And so they've been resisting this NATO, quote, goal to spend more on the military. So we've been very much against NATO to begin with. Now we focus more on don't expand NATO, but we think it's important once this crisis is over to go back to and build a much stronger movement against NATO. So we explain the U.S. role, whether it's NATO expansion, U.S. involvement in the 2014 coup, U.S. sending of weapons to Ukraine for years now, the U.S. pulling out during the Trump time of treaties with Russia, the aggressive stance that the U.S. has taken towards Russia in many different spheres. But again, Mitch, we say this doesn't justify the invasion at all. It helps explain a part of it, but certainly doesn't justify it.
Now, you have spent a lifetime opposing war, opposing the United States policy when it comes to war, opposing the number of wars that the United States has engaged in, whether they're declared a war or not. And you've also opposed the United States supporting other countries' wars as well. This time, however, the one who's doing the military attacking of another country, meaning Russia, is a country that is not aligned with the United States, but I guess counter to it in many ways. Does that complicate things for the anti-war left here in America?
Absolutely, because you look at who is most passionate about the crisis in Ukraine, and here in the US, it's Ukrainian Americans, and rightly so. Their relatives are being bombed, their relatives are being forced to flee, their relatives are under attack. And so they are the ones in the lead in calling for rallies around the issue of the US invasion. Their demands are different from our demands, though. So when you go to their rallies, you will see the calls for a greater U.S. involvement, more weapons being sent, a no-fly zone, or what they call clear skies. And so we feel very uncomfortable in their rallies because we feel that it's calling for more war, for a wider war. We understand why they're making the demands they're making, but we feel it's mistaken, that it will actually lead to more Ukrainians being killed. But it's been very difficult for us because when we call for protests, and we've called for now 2 international days of protests, the numbers that come out have been small. They've been actually in over 100 cities we've had protests, but they don't compare to the larger protests called by the Ukrainian Americans. And sometimes the 2 protests get mingled because we'll find out that they're on the same day at the same time in the same place. And I've had friends who've written to me and said, wow, I went to that protest thinking I was going to a peace protest, but it was the most pro-war peace protest I've ever been to. So it has been difficult, Mitch. And I think people are also very confused. And when people are confused, they tend not to come out. On the other hand, what we have done that I think has been very useful is done a lot of teach-ins like you have been doing, and they've been attended. We've had webinars that have had thousands of people on them. And we've also hooked up with our friends in Europe because this is an issue that is so much closer to them. They can get more people out on the streets. They have very important voices that the Americans have to hear from. And so we have joined up with members of parliament from Germany, from France, as well as anti-war voices from the Ukraine, from inside Russia. And we think that has helped us to have an international perspective. But yes, this has been unlike any other times when our government has been doing the aggression, and it's been difficult to counter the narrative on the mainstream media. I mean, when we were going out against the war in Iraq, we were being, we had death threats against us. We were being tarred as anti-American, as Saddam lovers. It's always been hard to come out against war, but this is a more complicated one.
Yeah. With 2003, and this radio network was right there with you, I believe. In 2003, we were very clear. We were against war. We were against the United States war. But this time it's a different country counter to our own country. So I guess, what do you call for then? Do you see this as, well, I'm an American citizen, meaning, and of course you don't have to be an American citizen, but you know what I mean. I'm in the United States. I have most effect on how my own country behaves rather than here's what I can do to affect Vladimir Putin. Do you put your efforts towards both? Do you protest Russia while you also protest the United States? How do you approach this?
We put our number one is how can we have a positive impact on finding a solution? And that means how can we push our White House and our Congress not to fan the flames of the war, but to really support the negotiations. And right now, that means rejecting a no-fly zone. When Zelensky spoke at the Capitol, we were outside there. We knew his plea was going to be for more weapons, warplanes, and a no-fly zone. And so we were very clear outside with messages that said Russian troops out, peace in Ukraine. But our main message was one that said no-fly zone plus warplanes equals World War III, because we think it's so important to actually hold the line that Biden and most of Congress have been holding until now, saying that they understand that sending in the fighter planes as well as a no-fly zone will lay the groundwork for a direct U.S. confrontation with Russia, which could lead to a much wider war, including a nuclear war. So that's the narrow focus that we have right now. Don't go into a wider war. Let's let the negotiations move forward. We are heartened by the fact that the negotiations now seem to be moving forward, that there are talks that have not ended in one day like the last few ones have, but now 4 days of talks with a number of points that seem to be in agreement, including that Ukraine will not seek membership in NATO, but will be a neutral state with guarantees that seem to be difficult ones to work out about how their security would be guaranteed by countries like the US or the UK or Turkey without it being a NATO type situation. But we are heartened by that. So I think right now, the really critical thing is don't let this become a wider war and create the space and be pushing our representatives to support the negotiations. I listened very carefully to Biden's State of the Union, to Zelensky talking to Congress, Biden's response, and nowhere in any of them do I hear this plea for negotiations that will put a quick end to this war. So that's what we, as the peace-loving people of this country, have to be focusing on.
Going back to, I guess it was yesterday, you were protesting at the Capitol as Zelensky was addressing Congress via video. It made me think when you mentioned that in his call for additional military assistance in a no-fly zone, it made me think of an interview that we conducted last week with Yulia Yurchenko. She is a political economist from Ukraine. She teaches in the United Kingdom, but she's now back in Ukraine because of the war. And she's a Marxist. She's firmly on the left. She thinks that the war that has been raging since 2014 has been a war between two capitalist interests, two capitalist states. She's very critical of it. However, she's there because of the war. And she was talking about sometimes we have to recognize our own contradictions. She said, I am anti-war, but right now I support military assistance because we're under attack. My neighborhood was being bombed. Now, I received a lot of emails, both positive and negative, about all the conversations that I've done. You won't be surprised about that. But you know, a lot of emails, but some were very angry that she said that we'd have her on saying that. And I guess my thought about that, and I guess I think this about Zelensky too, and this is my connection, is that you really, whether if you think it's a good idea or not, you can't really blame them asking for this assistance as they're being attacked.
Absolutely not. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, and we have to be compassionate towards the Ukrainians, understanding all of the contradictions. But we also have to have our own analysis of what's best for stopping this war from becoming a war that engulfs all of Europe, engulfs the US, and could become a nuclear war. And so our perspectives are different. I understand that my government has been putting weapons into Ukraine for years now, and now the unbelievable numbers from Biden announcing another 800 million cavalierly, like that was nothing, on top of a $13.6 billion package that he had just announced. I mean, massive amounts of weapons are going into Ukraine right now. Looking at the larger picture, you know, it's not only, Mitch, how this will expand the war and more people will get killed, but in whose hands will those weapons land? Even if there is a peace deal, where are all these weapons going to go? And, we have been here before. We've seen what happens when the U.S. throws so many weapons into Iraq or Afghanistan, and then we see the results of that and the groups that form out of that. And we know there are Nazi battalions in Ukraine now. We know there are people from other right-wing nationalist groups that are going to Ukraine to get training, and they'll have weapons. So where will all this lead in the long run? So yes, I understand where they're coming from, but I think they're wrong.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the anti-war group Code Pink. She joins us for a conversation as we continue to get perspectives concerning the war in Ukraine. I think one thing that does unite most anti-war people is that they would like this war to end. How do you think the best way to end? What do you think is the best way to end this war?
This war will end at the negotiating table. That's how it has to end. And as I said, I think there is some progress being made. This is not only affecting the people in Ukraine, it's certainly affecting people in Russia already with the sanctions that are hurting more perhaps than Putin ever bargained for. But there are also a rippling effect way beyond that. We're seeing around the world the price of gasoline soaring. We're seeing the prices of food going up. The grain belt that is Ukraine and Russia and not being able to send those exports is having an effect in countries from the Middle East to Africa. And so I think there is a sense of desperation to try to find a quote, off-ramp for this. And so I think supporting the peace talks is what we have to do. There are solutions to this, Mitch. There were the Minsk agreements that were finalized, the Minsk II in 2015, that if implemented, would have solved a lot of this, but they weren't implemented. Now there has to be not only a negotiated solution, but a way to verify it. And I think the UN is very much aware and involved in this. The entire European Union is very much committed to a solution that will be verifiable. So I think, what we have to do is get our own government to say what it is willing to see as the compromises and to be pushing Zelensky to make those compromises as well. But peace talks are happening, and they are the only way to end this war.
Going back to the economic sanctions, we can maybe even say financial warfare. It seems like, in a way, we have approached a new moment when a country that had been fully integrated into the global economic system has suddenly been cut off. There would be those who might say, well, if you're not going to send military aid to support Ukraine as it's being invaded from Russia, this is another way that we should stop a country from invading another sovereign country.
Yeah, I think, if you want to take away the yachts and the private planes and the mansions of Russian billionaires, that's fine with me. But when you go to sanctions that really affect the everyday people in Russia who did not vote for this war, who have no blame for this war, then we are talking about collective punishment. We've seen the U.S. using this kind of collective punishment all over the world. I've just come back in the last month twice from being in Cuba and see the effect of 60 years of sanctions that have been tightened by the Trump administration and then tightened even further under the Biden administration that are making people's lives miserable. And we see that in so many places around the world. We should not be punishing the Russian people for what their government is doing. And as I said, Mitch, it's not just punishing the Russians now, it's punishing people far and wide who had nothing to do with this. and are the ones that are suffering the consequences. I also want to say, yesterday when we were outside the Capitol in our protest, there was the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, right after Zelensky talked, did a press conference. It was a year after the attack on Asians in Georgia, and it was a Stop Asian Hate rally. And we were very respectful and stopped our protests while that was going on. But afterwards, we went up to the Congress people and said, don't you understand, especially what the Democrats have been doing to vilify Russia for so many years now, has it fed right into the Russophobia that we are experiencing in this country and elsewhere around the world, where Russian students are being attacked, Russian restaurants are being attacked, where Russian sports figures are being attacked, where even Russian cats are being attacked in the International Cat Federation. So this attack on Russians is really wrongheaded and, again, is blaming the victims.
You are a close observer of Congress. What are your thoughts on how the Progressive Caucus, and to be clear, when we say progressive, it's the biggest caucus on Congress. Not everyone in there you would necessarily consider to be progressive, but at least the who we consider to be sort of the leaders of this caucus. How are they responding to this war, in your view?
I think that the Progressive Caucus in general has been pretty good on this, but not strong enough. This all relates to the issue of the Pentagon budget, Mitch, as well, which we have to bring in when we talk about U.S. militarism. And the Progressive Caucus talks a good line about wanting to cut the Pentagon budget, but doesn't really fight for it. I mean, if you compare the fights around domestic issues that the progressive leaders put up to what happens in every year when the Pentagon budget is being passed, they might put out some tweets, they might put out a statement, but they don't put up a fight. And I think that has been very problematic. I do think there have been some good efforts in Congress to say that Biden cannot go to war around Ukraine without first going to Congress, so needing an authorization for the use of military force. And there certainly are members of Congress, and here we can go way beyond the Progressive Caucus. We see people like Marco Rubio vehemently opposed to a no-fly zone. And that is a positive thing. But I don't think the leaders of or the Progressive Caucus in general have been very strong on foreign policy issues in general. I mean, they've been pretty good on things like the war in Yemen. But let's face it, Mitch, it's a Democrat that's in the White House. They're fighting their own president. And so they don't throw themselves into it the way they would if it was Trump in the White House.
Medea Benjamin, I do thank you.
Nice to be on with you, Mitch, and thanks for all the great work that you've been doing.